Thanks very much for your time, Kev. And first up, just want to say a big congratulations for the progress you've been making. I'm curious as to how it feels from your perspective with regards to what have we got? Two popes, one queen, one prime minister so far.
Well, it feels good for, because it's very personal for me. It's been 25 years. I've had friends die, my family break up. I've seen the effect of these crimes on the ground with people, as I did for many years as a clergyman. But just as a human being, you've got to be happy that these crimes by the powerful are being exposed, and we're having an effect way beyond our numbers. So, I often say to people, I can die happy because, I've just stood by what I know is right, and what else can you do, right?
Yeah, I was having a look at your book, Unrelenting, and a couple of names spring to mind, and you wonder, back from the early days, how these guys are. I appreciate there's been a couple of people that didn't make it, fallen comrades, you might say, such as Harriet was an interesting character, but also Don Epperson. I
Yeah.
guess he was pretty old, right?
Oh, I knew him in my 20s. We're talking like 40 years ago. Um, he was just, it's funny how people have that impact. You don't realize at the time the impact one person can have on your life, right? Kind of like plants a seed. But he used to do these one-man pickets outside City Hall in Hamilton, which is a big steel town. It's where I worked there in my 20s, steel industry. And Don used to just not worry about how he looked or the effect it'd have. He just was there. And he'd been fighting that way his whole life. He was just a fighter. And he had amazing stories, right, of what it was like in the Depression, how brutal it was, people being killed left and right by the police all the time, by the army. It's that way all over the world. And so he just inspired me that he, in his 70s, he was almost 80. He was still going strong, right? Because he knew what was right.
And he gave you a bit of a hard time back then for joining the church, for becoming a clergyman.
Well, for going to university, I left Hamilton to go to Vancouver to go to school. And he didn't like that. He thought I should stay there and do what needed to be done. And I think later when I didn't become a minister for like 10 years after that, after I started university. But I think if he had known, yeah, he would have had a problem with that for sure.
And another name that I couldn't see how it unfolded was Katie at the churches. She
Oh,
was
yeah.
how's she? Is she still with us?
As far as I know, I haven't been in touch with her for quite a while. She's, well, since last year sometime. She's native. She's Huron from Eastern Canada. And, when people find out their native ancestry, it does a funny thing. In Canada, it's so suppressed. Like I had a great grandmother who was Cree, Ojibwe Cree in Winnipeg, and nobody in the family talked about it. They said, no, we're pure Scottish, Scots Irish. But I said, well, in Canada, anywhere in North America, it's unlikely that anybody, or anywhere in the world for that matter, that anyone's pure anything, right? So she's had her own struggle trying to find out who she is and why there's such an enormous guilt and denial about Indigenous people, probably no doubt because people know after our work especially what we did to so many of them and their children, right?
Right. And so you talk about that sort of family secret of the Indigenous aspect, and then you can get straight into the sort of eugenics and the stock aspect. And reading your book about the horrors with Shaw, the little girl who was kicked down the stairs.
Maisie Shaw, yeah.
Maisie Shaw. And so you wonder how the lack of empathy, we're talking psychopathy here, a guy kicks a little girl down a flight of concrete steps and she dies at the bottom in front of her friends. Is that pretty much how it is?
Well, Harriet Nahani was hiding under the stairs. It was on Christmas Eve, 1946. And you see, Harriet was a traditionalist. Her dad was a traditional CM or elder. And they targeted the children of that because they had authority. I remember Harriet said, whenever they were given an order in the school, the kids would look to her to see if they should, you know, go along with it, because they traditionally look to the elders in their families. But Harriet,
and she was a chief's daughter.
yeah,
Yeah.
but because of that, this Alfred Caldwell, the principal, would target her. She said they took me into his office every night and raped her year after year, just constant. So that night, Christmas Eve, Harriet was hiding from Caldwell under the stairs. She heard his familiar voice arguing with a matron about Maisie, who was crying for her mother. And she was looking up, and she saw Caldwell kick her in the stomach, went flying down the stairs. And then Harriet, we've got that interview of her describing her eyes weren't moving, she wasn't breathing, she was just lying there. And they just ignored her. They kept arguing at the top of the stairs. So it shows you like the inhumanity, right, going on all over. That's one story of many.
And you print a list of the crimes in Unrelenting regarding all these methods of torture and brutality that just are so congruent with what we know about the Nazis. I visited Auschwitz, and the one you mentioned in the list of crimes, official crimes, about standing in the freezing cold with the ice, that really took me straight back to a time I visited in Auschwitz, and that's what the Nazis were doing to concentration camp visitors there. So we have these kind of connotations and clear links with the concentration camps. And then you look at the transference of European Nazism over the Atlantic with these rat lines of the Catholic Church and with the Operation Paperclip, and we come to some serious characters who spanned the Atlantic, and we're talking Joseph Mengele style brutality on these Indigenous kids in Canada, right?
Yeah, actually, more Nazis were brought to Canada after World War II than any country in the world. Thousands were brought in, often to get fake IDs and then brought down to the US, kind of in the back door, to work on the space program, all the MK Ultra mind control research pioneered by the Nazis. These guys were the infamous example of Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's chief of counterintelligence on the Eastern Front, recruited by the CIA, helped formulate State Department Cold War policies, helped set up the CIA because of his extensive intel network in Eastern Europe, right? But part of that was these medical doctors. A lot of them stayed in Canada and worked at places like the Allen Institute in Montreal, where this Dr. Ewan Cameron was pioneer in reshaping memory and personality. Used a lot of kids. We've had eyewitnesses describe Native children literally being brought in cages and then experimented to death, you know, right up to the 1980s, you know, this stuff going on and still going on, just more hidden. And so, yeah, there was a direct Nazi link, but don't forget the whole eugenics movement actually began in America and was picked up by the Nazis, like the first sterilization laws against Aboriginal people, against the so-called mentally defective, brought in America in the 1880s and 90s, right into the early 20th century. So it's kind of like there's cross-Atlantic, you know, sharing of all these genocidal crimes going on, right?
Well, you can go even more global, can't you? With you know, you look at the stolen generation of Australia and this sort of thing, and we're dealing with a present-day global network that still functions intrinsically with this sort of thing in the shadows, right?
We find that especially the more research we did on the Vatican connection and how at the center of all of the stuff the Vatican's been for many centuries. You know, they just keep cropping up like a dirty sock all the time, wherever you look. And also, not only because they have so much money and state support, but it's writing their history. You know, all the first laws authorizing the conquest, you know, the Inter Caetera bulls of the 15th century all came out of Rome. It all justified genocide, right?
And you get members of the public today, and they like to box it and contain it and put it aside as something bad that happened historically. But we're talking centuries, if not more, with regards to a very similar thread of oppression, enslavement, invasion, murder, right? That the Catholic Church won't be able to palm off as a couple of individuals gone bad.
No, and the simplest proof of that is if you go to our website, murderbydecree.com, and you go into Appendix 4, we've reprinted this document that was leaked from a Vatican library insider to the London Observer in 2004. It's called Crimen Solicitanus, which in Latin means the crime of solicitation. And it refers to the standing Catholic Church policy when children are raped. And it says, first of all, it's a pontifical secret, which means it's coming from the Pope and no one's to talk about it. If you talk about it, and if you tell a policeman that this child's been raped by a priest, you're excommunicated, right? So it's a green light to every child rapist to say you can come into the Catholic Church, you'll be protected, and anyone who snitches is thrown into hell, which is what a Catholic thinks of excommunication, right?
And then you come to this the cover-up Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Canada, and you mentioned in the book about how the church seemed to palm off the culpability, the guilt, towards the state, i.e., the governmental forces. That was quite interesting to me. That suggests the hierarchy. It has the church very much above the government, and the government can be the scapegoat of the church.
Right. They've had that tag team relationship from the very beginning. They both set up these death camps they call residential schools, where over half the kids never came back, and that death rate spanned decades. It wasn't just one occurrence. It was a constant feature of a death rate 2 to 3 times that you'd find in the African slave trade, the Black Death in Europe. Even the death rate in Auschwitz and Treblinka was about half of what it was in your average Indian residential school. And yet this is not called genocide. So the churches and government did it all along. They set up their own inquiry. They control the process. They appoint the commissioners. They're not allowed to take any evidence which names a crime or a perpetrator. They go through the statements of Native survivors to edit out anything they don't like. And no charges are ever laid. And the whole thing is eventually put under secret reps. And the Canadian Ontario Court of Appeal recently ruled that they can destroy all the evidence if they want from a crime scene. Courts in Canada allow that, right?
So we got the church, which is a transnational criminal organization. We got the government, which is scapegoated by the church and taking the heat for these concentration camps for children. We got the legal system, which is a complete joke and totally corrupt. And then plus there's aspects of the corporate side where they're clearing large parts of Canada in order to gain access to the land, because if the people are gone, then it's fair game for the companies to make profit from. And so basically, are we looking at Native Canadian children, not necessarily not necessarily children, but also perhaps adults as well? They're almost residual collateral from the clearing of the profitable land in Canada. Is that fair enough summary?
Yeah, very much. As a matter of fact, it's one of the ways it still goes on. One of the things we document now, there's 2 clusters in Canada on the West Coast and in northern Saskatchewan, where on the prairies, where these massive disappearances of not just Native women, but whole families are going on. And it's because there's valuable resources there. Uranium in northern Saskatchewan, that's where the US military get most of their depleted uranium from Canada. And on the West Coast, because of all the resources there, which are largely owned by Chinese corporations. And our sources tell us all the time that these Native families are being terrorized off their land with the help of the government chiefs, disappeared entirely, killed off or scared off, just to get those lands and resources like the British used to do, and now then the Americans, now the Chinese are doing it. I mean, it's the same old game.
Yeah, you hear identical stories from the Amazon, South America.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kev, can I ask a little more of a broad question regarding Christianity as a whole? I'm trying to join the dots between the horrific child abuse, horrors, murders, ritual sacrificial stuff, and the more lower down everyday situation with regards to people who have Christianity at the core of their essence and their faith. The logo of Christianity is of an indigenous son being sacrificed in the most torturous manner imaginable. In light of recent common law revelations of evidence regarding the mandatory participation of all popes in ninth circle cult child-killing ceremonies involving drinking the blood and eating the flesh, what basis can the Christian faith continue as a reputable foundation for public spirituality?
Well, I don't think it can. As a matter of fact, for people to even donate money to the Catholic or the Anglican Church, or in Canada, the United Church, means under international law, they're committing a felony. They're funding what's called transnational criminal organizations that harm people, traffic children, launder money for organized crime.
So can we condense that in and say that anybody who is participating in Christianity, particularly if they're funding Christianity, regardless of denomination, is complicit in a transnational criminal organization?
Well, de facto, yes. One example of that is the Pope recently spoke to the World Council of Churches, which is an umbrella group for all the Protestant churches, most of them in the world, except the more fundamentalist ones. And they are all in agreement with his plan to have one world church affiliated through the Church of Rome, which means the Vatican Bank. And so, yes, they're all directly complicit. And it's kind of like saying, you can be, let's say you're an anti-Semite and you're convinced Jews are running the world. You may not be a member of the Nazi party of their particular church, but your ideology is contributing to that crime. And that was described in Nuremberg, and so being all the basis of international human rights conventions ever since, that you're complicit if you're paying those taxes, if you're putting money in the church or attending it. So the very image of Jesus dying on a cross, don't forget the cross didn't appear till about the 3rd century, when the Catholic Church was being incorporated as the first corporation really in Rome. And it became the Roman state. I mean, the Roman state transmorphed into the Catholic Church. So even the term Pontifex Maximus, the Great Bridge that the Roman Emperor used, that's the Pope's official title, right? Vicari Christi, the replacement of Christ. I mean, it's all there for people to see, right? If you go beneath the surface and see that it is a criminal syndicate.
And with the crucifix, it's almost as though it's a sort of a voodoo warning, perhaps, that if the Pontifex is deified, is the God here on earth, and then the indigenous son is slaughtered on a cross. Watch out, everybody! Buckle under, otherwise this could happen to you. This is the subcontext, right?
Very much, and that in fact is how any elite historically has ever ruled. You keep the majority of people traumatized and in fear, and incapable of accessing their indigenous power. Like when Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." He didn't say it was externally. He didn't say it was in a church or a pope or a communion wafer. He said it's here. We're self-governing. That's what the Founding Fathers of America said. Sovereignty rests here, begins and ends here in each one of us. It's not given to you. You're born with it. You just have to exercise it. That's natural law, common law. And so that is greater than any legal system or political system on the planet. And rulers don't want us to access that knowledge and practice it. And we saw just a few of us doing this work. Look at the effect it had, because they're afraid, and they hide behind, like in the Wizard of Oz, a little man behind the big mask. That's exactly who they are. So we just have to pull the mask back.
And you've done so with Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, and also with Bergoglio, Pope Francis. So that's two tips of the pyramid that are officially criminals, have been found guilty by common law courts, which span the international borders, and are, so people are now at liberty to put a posse together and haul in either pope and incarcerate him, right?
They have